It is 10 minutes past 11. Really appreciate your company. Elton John on the way. We've got Bob Marley on the way. Some fantastic tunes. ABC, also the All Saints as well. And I've got such an interesting guest coming in today. We're going to be talking to a lady called Judith McMinn. Judith is from Rowlands Gill, and she's launched an incredible contact sports headband. It's really game-changing, in inverted commas. So if you ever watch sport, I do wonder about this. And I remember, when the kids were little and they played sport, I used to think, oh God, I can see their heads clanging together, and, worrying about why we would get shin protectors, but then we wouldn't protect their heads. It's an extraordinary thing, isn't it? You'll put the shin pads on, you're all yelling and where's the shin pads on a Sunday morning when you're late for footy, but you're not asking about the kids' brains. Well, Judith McMinn has launched this incredible Halos, I think that's how we say it, headband. So we're going to talk to Judith about that in about the next 10 minutes or so. Lisa Stanfield, all around the world on BBC Radio Newcastle. It is the sound of the North East. 11:15. We've got some really good music to come. Bob Marley coming up, ABC coming up as well. It is Anna here through until 2 o'clock. So I feel slightly embarrassed because I've got a lovely guest in the studio, and Judith McMinn. And Judith, I'm in my Wellington boots today. I hope you don't mind.
I don't mind at all, Anna, and thanks very much for the opportunity to come in.
Pleasure. They're a birthday present, so that's why I'm in my Wellington boots today. But I thought the Queen wouldn't mind my Wellington boots. We've been chatting about the Queen's wardrobe as well. And incidentally, if you've missed that a little bit early, you can get it back on BBC Sounds. We were chatting to Sally Hughes, who's a beauty journalist, and she wrote a fantastic book all about the Queen. Judith, just before we get on to the very important, massively important reason that you're in the studio today, have you had any royal connections at all?
I sadly never met the Queen, but my father received an MBE a number of years ago. And I have to say, while it was the most amazing day to go to Buckingham Palace and to be in the presence of Princess Anne, for my dad to receive it in recognition of 40 years working in local government, we were disappointed the day we came down, the morning we were coming down the Mall, and we sort of stuck our heads out the taxi window to see if we could see the Standard. And that was the only disappointing bit, that we knew that day it wouldn't be the Queen presenting it to Dad. But other than that, it was a fantastic day. And I think one of the things that really for me about the Queen is, never met her, but like everyone else, you feel you knew her. And you have to salute her for the countries that she visited, for certainly the places she visited on this island, and the interest she took in products that she would never use. Yeah,
and the interest in sport as well, which is what brings us here today.
Well, yeah, I mean, you think of the two most iconic moments in sport in this country, and that's the handing over of the 1966 World Cup, which of course was done by the Queen, and then the 2012 Olympics and her grand entrance to that.
With James Bond.
With James Bond. So, she really is. And then, of course, she was patron for all the various sporting bodies, including the FA at a time, etc.
Yeah, massive in sport, massive in, in the horse world as well. Just, a very, very important lady as far as that's concerned. And we're chatting about sport because if you listen to the show now, when you watch sport, I don't know if you feel this, listen to the show, but I know I have felt it, particularly actually when I'm watching my own kids when they were little, we'd be running around looking for shin pads, and yet we would never think about a headband. We'd never think about protecting our brains. So why did we protect our shins and not our brains? And you've invented something incredible, Judith, and we're going to talk about this in a minute, but let's just talk about why our brains are so important to protect.
Well, the brain is the most complex object on this earth. Our brain determines us. So it determines our mood, our thinking, our processing. So your brain makes you, Anna. My brain makes me, makes everyone. And in sport, we think about performance as below the neck. We think about being faster, fitter, stronger, etc. But actually, the performance comes from the brain. Whether we take that move, how we take that free kick, whether we take that tackle. And sport has never really quite comprehended that. And, it comes back to this idea about the brain. And because we take the brain for so granted, because we can't see the brain in the same clarity, we can see knees and joints and some of the biomarkers and some of the tests we can't do with the brain, then we've just neglected it and just taken it for granted. And it's only when we lose our brain or lose the functioning around it that we really appreciate what we've lost. And earlier you were talking to one of your listeners who was 91, and she made a comment. She said, I'd be very happy to live to 100 if I had my brain. And that was a very striking comment as I was listening to that, because the brain really determines how you perform in sport and in life.
It's quite interesting that, isn't it? Because we'll go to the gym and obviously exercise affects your brain, but we'll go to the gym or we'll do loads of walking. but we maybe don't do as much mental agility as we should. You know, your Sudokus, all of those things, thinking, reading, trying to push ourselves forward. I don't think we do use it enough.
Probably not, and probably brain health is something that we've been very late to catch on to. We've been talking about cardio, we've been talking about muscle, we've been talking about rest, nutrition, sleep is probably the closest we get to the brain.
Yeah.
But the thing about the brain is that, you know, you need to protect it in the same way. And that's really then why brain protection is what we've focused on. And there is a difference between, and I would say this to the listeners, there's a difference between brain protection and head protection.
Yeah.
The skull is repairable. The brain is not. I mean, you can't get a brain transplant.
No, I know, yeah, absolutely. And I think what's interesting is when you mentioned that we're very late to this, I'm sure lots of people will remember when Liam Neeson's wife had that skiing accident, and you know, and there's dry slope at Silksworth. You know, lots of kids have gone at school and things up to Silksworth. We never even thought about wearing a helmet to fly 90 mile an hour down a hill. And it's extraordinary. Everybody then suddenly starts thinking about it. But then why would we run around on a footy pitch or run around on a rugby pitch and not think that we're going to clash into each other and hurt ourselves as well?
Yeah, and there's something really quite important to talk about here. So helmets protect against, for the most part, linear forces. Linear forces are straight line forces, which is what you would receive if you fell to the ground skiing or on a bike helmet. But in contact sports and in sports where we have head to ball, head to knee, head to ground, head to elbow, those are rotational forces. They come from angled hits and they cause the brain to rotate inside the skull. Yeah. So our brain can only move on a linear plane, which is back and forward, or rotate. And when it rotates, that does more damage than linear.
Oh, that's interesting.
And if the brain cells are torn, the blood vessels are torn, and it disrupts the brain. And it's these rotational forces that are the risk in playing contact sports. So it's still good to wear a helmet to protect you against skull fractures, but the skull fracture is not the risk when you're playing rugby, hockey or football and other sports. It is rotational. These angled hits, which you take 40, 50 perhaps in a game, that cause the brain to rotate. And the brain is estimated to be able to rotate, up to plus or minus 5 millimetre.
Oh, that's interesting. I had no idea. I'm sure listening to the show, that's might not be news to you, might be more educated than me, but that's definitely news to me. So you've come up with this incredible device, which I haven't opened yet. So I'll tell you what we're going to do. Just tell us what it's called, first of all.
So the company's called Reason, R-E-Z-O-N, and that's a play on reason, because a very good reason to protect the brain. And we've developed a protective headband with 9 layers, which we call halos.
Yep. And this is made in the Northeast?
The company is Northeast based, but it's made in Sheffield, made in Yorkshire, and it's an all British supply chain. And we're very proud to have something that's got real roots here in the Northeast and made in Britain.
Right. I'm going to take a tune and then you're going to talk us through this. And also, if you have just joined us, chatting to Judith, come up with this incredible invention, and surely a necessity, I'd have thought, in terms of sport and contact sports. We're going to chat because also Judith is the director of Northumberland County Football Association. So we're going to talk more about grassroots sports as well. It's 11:22. This is Elton John and Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. John and Goodbye Yellow Brick Road. It's 11:25. We've got ABC to come. We've got All Saints as well. It's Anna here through until 2 o'clock. Taking your memories and your calls still, of course, on Queen Elizabeth II, and guiding you through all the big events that will be happening in the coming days as well. Had a really great guest on, by the way, yesterday from the Hindu community. And if you're interested, they're having a really amazing service 12 o'clock on Sunday at the Hindu Temple in Newcastle. If you want to listen back to that, because it was a really good chat, you can listen back on BBC Sounds. Got a fantastic guest in the studio now, equally interesting. Judith McMinn is from Roland's Gill, and she has launched a game-changing contact sports headband which aims to reduce the risk of brain damage. So we've just been chatting about this, Judith, and how really it's strange, isn't it, how we think we can come back stronger from an injury, and people say, oh, I'll come back stronger from that thigh tear, or that isn't a specific word, thigh tear, by the way. I don't think that's what they say. It's something else. But you'll come back stronger, but not from a brain injury.
No, not at all. And that's just one of the things that I think is quite strange, given that sport is such a commercial industry.
Yeah.
And, the players that we see in the Premier League and at the top of every sport, these are multi-million-pound assets.
Yeah.
And the thing about brain injury, it doesn't matter what level you play at, what sport you play at. So whether you're playing in Ashington or Anfield, your brain is as vulnerable to
and
an
it's
impact.
Important,
And important, because you need your brain in sport and in life. And that is why we have developed something to protect your performance in sport and in life.
Right, so talk me through this. So just to explain, if you listen to the show now, I've got a little packet, kind of a rectangle oblongy packet. Right, so we're opening it up. Reason, protect your performance. Talk us through this. It's a headband.
It's a headband. And it's a headband which is 70 grams and 9.5 mil thick, so it's really light. It comes in different sizes to fit different head shapes and sizes, and the band is designed to reduce these rotational forces that I was just mentioning a few moments ago. So rotational forces come from angled impacts which cause the brain to rotate inside the skull. And it also works to prevent or reduce linear forces, which cause the brain to move back and forth. But there are 9 layers in the band, and those layers move over each other in a zigzag way, so that when you take an impact on the outside of the band, by the time it comes through the layers and towards your skull, it's reduced by up to 60%.
And in terms of looking at how these injuries can affect you, I'm sure lots of people listening will have read lots of stories about professional sportsmen, and just explain CTE, what that is, and why we've all been hearing stories about sportsmen cope, and sportswomen, of course, and we're going to talk about the difference between men and women's brains as well, but sportsmen and their injuries.
Yeah, so I think, in the last number of years, certainly in this country, there's been an increasing awareness of former contact sports players who have developed a condition called CTE. In the US, that's been known for a little longer. It started from the NFL. Mike Webster was probably the first player there to become known and associated with, and probably some of the listeners have seen the film Concussion, which talked about this. But CTE is now probably the biggest risk for anyone who plays sport at an amateur, at a professional level across the globe. And CTE is caused by subconcussions. And subconcussions, while we're quite familiar with the term concussion, subconcussions are these smaller impacts that cause the brain to rotate. They're about a quarter of the force of a concussion, but they're 500 times more frequent. So in a match, players are taking 40, 50 subconcussions, and that's accumulating and accumulating. And 20% of people who were diagnosed with CTE in death never had a concussion. So while sport focuses on concussions, actually it's subconcussions that are the more dangerous. And that's not to say that a concussion isn't, of course it is, but it comes back to the point that every head impact has the potential to be career-ending and life-changing.
That's really interesting as well, what you said about how because when people think about concussion and when people think about head injuries and footballers, and a lot of the footballers that have talked very openly about what they're going through, and the families that have talked about it as well, you think about heading the ball. So you think about Shearer, for example, he's just popped in there, heading the ball. But it's not actually that heading. It's all the other impacts.
Correct. So if this was only about heading a football, why would CTE be in rugby or American football?
Yeah.
And if you look at head impacts in football, soccer, it will vary, of course, by position, and it will vary by league, etc. But you are looking at something probably in 10 to 15% of head impacts being to the head of the ball. It's head to ground, head to post, head to knee, head to head. And every one of those impacts causes the brain to rotate. And I think what is quite conflated and quite lost is the overemphasis on heading. And really, I think one of the messages we want to get out is that this is for every player. This product wasn't designed for Harry Kane or Marcus Rashford. It was designed for every player who is in a sport where there is a risk of a head impact and therefore a brain injury.
So how do you roll this out then? So you're board of director of Northumberland County Football Association. I'm thinking about practically, on a Sunday morning, we're running around, we're looking for shin pads, we can never find one boot, we can only ever find the other, we've got to find, little coats, off we go, where's the money for the flapjacks, watching the tear. So this is what you're saying, you need to remember this, and this is the first thing that people should be remembering. And how do you get this through the FA?
Well, it's wider than just the FA. I mean, this starts with every player, every coach and every parent thinking about the brain and how to protect it. So what I'm doing and what Reason is doing is giving people the opportunity to protect their performance. This is FIFA approved. It's CE marked. It's in fact the only CE marked product of its type.
What does that mean, CE marked?
So CE is an international safety standard for PPE, personal protective equipment. And this product is the only CE marked product of its type in the UK and Europe.
How do you test it? How do you know if these things work?
That's a great question, and something that I get asked all the time. So we developed this product starting in Rowlands Gill at the kitchen table. We moved it on to then working with manufacturers down in Sheffield. We sent the product for testing to Sheffield's Hallam, which is the leading research facilities in Europe, and then to Virginia Tech, which is the leading test house in the US, and then on to Italy to get to a test house there called a TELCERT. And they applied numerous tests around impact, wearability, etc., usage, etc. But I'm delighted to say that I work with the leading brain experts in the globe, which is a firm called Recognition Health based in London, and they are at the forefront of the development of neuroimaging technology. So we're also looking at what this actually could mean for the brain, as much as some of the more lab-based tests that, at the moment we can only utilise. So we're doing everything we can to put in evidence to this, and we have that all listed on our website. But the point is very much this, that, this is a very simple but fit-for-purpose product that reduces rotational forces to the skull and ultimately to the brain.
Judith, absolutely amazing. In fact, I think we're going to play another tune and come back, because I do want to chat about the difference between men's and women's brains. And if you listen to the show now, this is really interesting. It's worth sticking around for. And also, if you don't mind as well, Judith, because you didn't start off in inventing. I know that you were formerly Director of Operations for Tony Blair, so for the Institute for Global Change. So I think we might have a chat about that. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Brilliant. This is my guest, Judith McMinn, have I said that correctly yet?
Yes.
McMinn. Well
very
done.
good.
So Judith is with us talking about this, the headband, the Halos headband, but also we're going to chat a little bit more about how we look after our brains and the difference between men's and women's. Bob Marley and the Wailers on BBC Radio Newcastle. It is the sound of the North East. 24 minutes to 12. We've got the All Saints on the way, Glenn Campbell as well. We'll have all your latest news from 12 o'clock. And of course, taking your calls and memories. And we've had some fantastic, really interesting guests on the show talking about the Queen and memories of the Queen. And if you missed the last hour, we were chatting to Sally Hughes, a fantastic journalist from The Guardian. She's written loads of books. She's got a brand new book out called Everything is Washable, but she's also written a book called Our Rainbow Queen, all about the way that the Queen dressed, why she chose certain outfits, handbags as well. There's a really good little bit about her handbags and handbag signals. But right now, we've got a fantastic guest in the studio. Her name is Judith McMinn, and Judith has invented a headband which protects the brain. So not the skull, but the brain from lots of injuries which happen all the time during sport, not just in those big clashes that you see, and not just in heading the ball. So we've chatted about what the band does, Judith, and the fact that, it was invented up here in the North East at your kitchen table in Rowlands Gill. But the brain itself, which I think is very interesting, is between men and women is different, and the effects of concussion are different.
Yeah, so this is something that I think really is not known. We've known for 20 years that concussion is more dangerous in a woman. And I go round and I speak to coaches and I speak to players and I speak to clubs, and it's complete news to them. So in a woman, concussion is more impacted, it's more serious, it's longer recovery times, longer post-concussive symptoms, and there are a number of reasons for that. The microstructure of the brain cells in women are longer and thinner, they shear more easily. Hormones, depending on where you are in your menstrual cycle, and the amount of proestrogen. Neck strength is also considered. A woman has about a neck of about a 30% less girth than a man. Coaching regimes, management of injuries. And what is possibly most stark in this is that 80.1% of data around concussion is from a man.
Oh, that's interesting. Why is that?
Well, I think women have been quite slow to appreciate the difference, because, we're seeing a situation now where, rightly so, women's sport is coming to prominence. And women don't probably, some of the more senior and some of the more professional sports women I speak to, they don't want to make a difference. They want to play the men's game. They want to be in the same league as the men. They want the same playing style, etc. But actually, there is just a biological difference. And so, I think for some players, and we've been doing a world first pilot with a top rugby team. And I should say that only 1.2% of studies on concussion have ever featured an all-female team or participant. And in that team, we found a real lack of interest at all levels around being involved in this world first pilot. There were women who said, well, if my friend's not wearing it, I'm not wearing it. There was people who said, oh, I'm coming towards the end of my career, so why would I bother? And actually, at the heart of this was a lack of knowledge. And some people just didn't want to hear that. And this is not about scaring people. It's about making and giving an informed and an empowered choice. So these facts aren't going to go away. In fact, every day we know more and more about the brain. And we will come to understand the challenges and the dangers that come to the brain. So therefore, it is really about giving that choice to protect.
Absolutely. If people want more information about this and want to learn a little bit more, where can they find you, Judith?
So we have a website, Reason, REZON, wear.com. And on that, not only are we just talking about our product, but we hope we're giving enough insight to explain about the problem, about the technology and how we've developed it, and the science that goes behind this, and some of the key research papers. And there's a huge amount of research in this space. It doesn't always get the attention it deserves. It doesn't always get the media outings that it deserves. But we've put together what we hope is an informed website, as well as about the product.
And obviously, you're clearly a very organised person who knows what they're doing with the project. And this could be years of work, having to organise massive projects, because you were formerly Director of Operations for the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. How did that come about?
So I got a phone call one day, and somebody, it was a headhunter, and he said, we're looking for a chief operating officer for Tony Blair. Would you be interested? And I said, yeah, I would actually. So 8 interviews later.
Oh God, what were those interviews like?
Quite grueling.
Were they?
I found myself sitting in an armside chair at 9 Grosvenor Square in London, meeting Tony Blair. And I have to say, I've never been as nervous in my life. And I got news on the Thursday that I was going to meet Mr. Blair on the Tuesday, I think it was. And on 9 o'clock on that Saturday morning, I was the first in the queue at Waterstones here in Newcastle to buy Tony's book.
To learn a bit about him. Who would be your boss? I
made a decision that I couldn't read the whole book over the weekend. So I prepped like I was doing my finals at university, and I read key chapters. And I also sort of thought, if I could remember what I was going to say to him first off, I could talk about the middle bit. So I sort of, rehearsed saying, "Good morning, Mr. Blair. Thank you for your time." I thought, if I can get that out, I can talk about what I've done in my career, and I can get it done. And I have to say, I spent 5 years working for Tony Blair, and Tony Blair now, as we should say, and it was phenomenal. It was a super interesting place, global insights, diversity of thought, and a phenomenal boss.
Was he a good boss? Because I want to know the human. People listening always want to know the human side of these people, not the politician side, the human side.
He was very natural, very thoughtful.
Did he give you long coffee breaks, nice lunch breaks? Did he ever buy you a sandwich?
He was a phenomenal boss in that respect. Took great care of his people, and I'm still very pleased to say I received a Christmas card from him and Cherie. So he was a phenomenal boss, and he, despite whatever you think about his politics,
away from politics,
he has grown to be a statesman, a diplomat, a thinker. He's always been ahead of his time. He still is, and but I can speak and say, as a boss, I found him phenomenal, and I have to say, fantastic opportunity. And you know what? He really cared about the Northeast. He often asked me when I would be coming back at the weekends to home in Rolandskill, and we'd be speaking during the week, he'd say, how was things in the Northeast? He'd ask me about Durham. He'd ask me about Rolandskill. I used to tell him about being out on my bike on the Derwent Walk, and he knew the Derwent Walk. He knew Rolandskill. He really stayed connected long after he finished his term as MP.
Good stuff. We need people to know about the Northeast and not think that the world stops from Birmingham.
Correct.
Because it doesn't. And just very interesting, Judith, what would you say, if somebody listening now who's going for an interview, going into an interview process, because I am absolutely appalling in interviews. I'm dreadful. I don't think I've ever got a job through an interview. Maybe once. Weirdly, having done this job for 23 years, I'm not good in an interview. What would you say to anybody listening now are the key points that you should remember? Because that's a lot of interviews to go through. 8.
Be yourself.
Yeah. So
don't try to be something that you're not, because it won't work.
Yeah.
Do your research. Know what type of organisation you're joining. And just enjoy the experience, because the experience will give you a lot of insights about you personally, and maybe where you want to go. A lot of people do interviews sort of as crossroads in their careers. They don't know, maybe it's a promotion, maybe it's a change of career. Use interviews. And I always say to people, people I coach and mentor, do interviews because they keep you very fresh.
Yeah.
You're always constantly updating about yourself, telling your story. So I'd say, Anna, get an interview booked in soon.
Oh, where am I headed? Where am I going to work next? Fail to prepare to fail. That's what it is. Very, very nice chatting to you, Judith. Thank you so much for coming in the studio.
Anna, thanks so much.
Pleasure.